Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video.
Jon.
The morning of departure dawned gray and cold, with frost coating the stones of Winterfell's courtyard like a warning. Jon Snow stood in the shadow of the first keep, watching the organized chaos of a royal party preparing to leave. Servants loaded wagons with supplies, guards checked their weapons and armor, and horses stamped impatiently in the crisp air, their breath steaming in white clouds. He had made his choice in the Godswood 3 days ago, but the weight of it still sat heavy in his chest. Stay. Such a simple word for such a complex decision. Stay at Winterfell, where he had begun to remember what it felt like to belong somewhere. Stay and face whatever consequences Cersei Lannister might devise for a ward who had outlived his usefulness. Second thoughts. Jon turned to find Tyrion Lannister approaching, his mismatched eyes sharp with intelligence and something that might have been sympathy. The dwarf moved carefully across the uneven stones, his walking stick tapping a steady rhythm against the ground. "No," Jon said, though even to his own ears the word sounded less certain than he would have liked. "My decision is made." "Decisions can be unmade," Tyrion observed mildly. "Right up until the moment when they can't. The Queen is displeased with your choice. She's been quite vocal about it, in fact." Jon felt his stomach tighten. He had avoided Cersei for the past 3 days, knowing that any conversation between them would end badly, but he couldn't avoid her forever, and apparently his time had run out. "Where is she?" he asked. "Your Solar, waiting." Tyrion's expression was unreadable. "She sent me to fetch you." Politely, of course, though I suspect politeness will be in short supply once you're alone with her. Jon nodded, having expected as much. 15 years of Lancer training had taught him to read the subtle signs of royal displeasure, and Cersei had never been subtle when she felt her authority was being challenged. "Will you?" Jon began, then stopped. What was he asking for? Protection, support? Tyrion was clever and occasionally kind, but he was still a Lannister, still bound by family loyalty and political necessity. "I'll be nearby," Tyrion said quietly, "in case you need a witness to whatever conversation you're about to have." It was more than Jon had expected, and probably more than he deserved. He inclined his head in thanks and made his way toward the guest tower, his footsteps echoing off the ancient stones. Tyrion watched Jon disappear into the tower, then settled himself on a convenient bench where he could observe the comings and goings without appearing to eavesdrop. Not that he had any intention of actually eavesdropping, of course. That would be improper. The fact that sound carried remarkably well through the tower's windows was simply an architectural quirk he couldn't help but notice. He had spent the better part of 3 days trying to talk Cersei out of whatever she was planning. His sister had many virtues: intelligence, determination, fierce loyalty to her children, but forgiveness was not among them. She viewed Jon's decision to remain at Winterfell as a personal betrayal, a rejection of everything she had given him over the past 15 years. The truth was more complicated, as truth usually was. Jon Snow had been raised as a Lannister ward, trained in their ways, educated in their values, but he had never truly been one of them, and Cersei's inability to see that distinction was going to cause problems for everyone involved. Tyrion pulled out a small leather-bound book and pretended to read while keeping one ear tuned to the sounds from above. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just Jon's immediate future, but the long-term relationship between House Stark and House Lannister. No pressure at all. "Jon." Cersei Lannister stood with her back to the door when Jon entered the Solar, her golden hair catching the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. She wore traveling clothes, a practical riding dress in Lannister crimson, with a heavy cloak draped over one arm, but there was nothing practical about her posture, which radiated the kind of controlled fury that Jon had learned to fear during his early years at Casterly Rock. "Your Grace," he said, offering a careful bow. "Sit," she commanded without turning around. Jon remained standing. 15 years of training warred with 3 weeks of growing confidence, and for once, confidence won. "I prefer to stand, Your Grace." Cersei turned then, her green eyes blazing with an emotion that might have been rage or disappointment, or some combination of both. "You prefer," she repeated, her voice dangerously soft. "How interesting. When did you begin having preferences that differed from mine? I've always had them, Jon replied quietly. I simply learned not to express them. And now, what's changed? Jon met her gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of courage he hadn't known he possessed. I've remembered what it feels like to be myself instead of what others expect me to be. Cersei laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Yourself. And what exactly is that, Jon Snow? A bastard with delusions of belonging? A ward who's forgotten his place? A boy who thinks 3 weeks in his father's castle erases 15 years of debt and obligation? Each word was chosen to wound, delivered with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to strike for maximum damage. Jon felt the familiar urge to apologize, to placate, to smooth over the conflict with careful words and deferential gestures. Instead, he said, I'm someone who's learned the difference between gratitude and servitude. The words hung in the air between them like a blade. Cersei's face went very still, and Jon realized he had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Servitude, she repeated slowly. Is that what you call the life I gave you? The education, the training, the protection, the fact that you're alive at all instead of dead in some forgotten grave? I call it what it was, Jon said, his voice steadier than he felt. A political arrangement that served your purposes as much as it served mine. You needed a way to ensure Ned Stark's bastard wouldn't become a problem, and I needed to survive. It was never about kindness or charity. Cersei moved closer, her green eyes never leaving his face. You ungrateful little... I am grateful, Jon interrupted, surprising them both. More grateful than you'll ever know. You saved my life, gave me opportunities I never would have had otherwise. But gratitude doesn't mean I owe you my entire existence. Doesn't it? Cersei's voice was silk over steel. You seem to forget that your very survival depends on my continued goodwill. One word from me, one letter to the right people, and your comfortable little life here at Winterfell becomes very complicated indeed. There it was, the threat Jon had been expecting, delivered with the casual cruelty that made Cersei Lannister so dangerous. She was reminding him that he was still ultimately at her mercy, that his choice to stay at Winterfell was only meaningful as long as she allowed it to be. What exactly would you tell them? Jon asked, his voice carefully controlled. That your ward has chosen to remain with his own people. That a bastard from the north prefers the cold to the capital. What scandal is there in that? Cersei's smile was sharp as a blade. Oh, my dear boy. You still don't understand, do you? You think you're just some random bastard that I took pity on. You think your value to House Lannister was purely sentimental. Jon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What do you mean? I mean that bastards are common as dirt, but bastards with the right bloodline, those are precious indeed. Cersei circled him slowly, like a cat stalking wounded prey. Did you never wonder why my father agreed to take you as a ward? Why he was so interested in keeping one particular bastard alive and close? Because you're not just any bastard, Cersei continued, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. You're Ned Stark's bastard, the son of one of the most honorable men in the Seven Kingdoms, raised in the heart of Lannister power. Do you have any idea how valuable that makes you? Jon stared at her, his mind racing. Valuable how? As leverage, of course. As insurance against your father's honor getting the better of his political sense. As a reminder that even the great Ned Stark has weaknesses that can be exploited. Cersei's smile widened. Did you really think we kept you alive out of the goodness of our hearts? The words hit Jon like physical blows. 15 years of careful education, of training in swordplay and statecraft, of being treated as something approaching family, all of it had been calculated manipulation. He had been a hostage disguised as a ward, a weapon forged to be used against his own father. You're lying, he whispered, but even as he said it, he knew she wasn't. Too many things suddenly made sense. The careful way he had been educated, the subtle limits placed on his freedom, the way certain conversations had always stopped when he entered a room. Am I? Cersei moved closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Think, Jon, why else would we have invested so much time and effort in your education? You're not just a bastard, you're a Stark bastard, and that bloodline, that connection to the north, makes you infinitely more useful than some random hedge knight's byblow. Jon felt trapped between impossible truths, Everything he had believed about his life, about his place in the world, was crumbling around him. He had thought himself fortunate to be taken in by House Lannister, grateful for opportunities that most bastards could never dream of. Instead, he had been a pawn in a game he hadn't even known was being played. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally, his voice hoarse. "Loyalty," Cersei said simply. "The same loyalty you've shown for 15 years, the understanding that your survival depends on our continued goodwill, the wisdom to remember that some truths are too dangerous to be spoken aloud." It was a threat wrapped in reasonable language, a reminder that his newfound independence was an illusion that could be shattered with a few carefully chosen words. Jon felt the weight of his true position settling on his shoulders like a cloak made of lead. But beneath the fear and confusion, something else stirred. Anger, perhaps. Or determination. He had spent 15 years being shaped by other people's expectations, molded into whatever they needed him to be. He had just begun to discover who he might be if left to choose for himself. He wasn't ready to give that up. Not yet. "I understand," he said carefully, "but my decision remains the same. I'm staying at Winterfell." Cersei's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Even knowing what you know now, even understanding that your father's honor won't protect you, if I decide you've become more liability than asset." "Especially knowing what I know now," Jon replied, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "If I truly am what you say I am, a tool to be used against my father, then I need to understand what that means, and I can't do that from the shadow of your influence." For a moment, Cersei looked as if she might strike him. Then her expression smoothed into the pleasant mask she wore when conducting court business. "Very well," she said. "But remember, Jon Snow, secrets have a way of coming to light when you least expect them. And when yours does, I hope you'll remember who tried to protect you from the consequences." She swept past him toward the door, then paused at the threshold. "Give my regards to your father," she said, the word dripping with false sweetness. "I'm sure he'll be very interested to know that his bastard son has finally learned the truth about his circumstances." Then she was gone, leaving Jon alone with the weight of knowledge he had never wanted, and the terrible understanding that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. Tyrion watched his sister emerge from the tower, her face set in the expression he had learned to associate with barely controlled fury. Whatever had transpired in that solar, it hadn't gone according to Cersei's plans. A few minutes later, Jon appeared, moving like a man who had just received news of his own execution. His face was pale, his usual composure cracked around the edges, and his hands trembled slightly as he walked. "Rough conversation?" Tyrion asked mildly as Jon approached. Jon looked at him with eyes that seemed older than they had been an hour ago. "She told me the truth about why I was taken as a ward." Tyrion nodded, understanding immediately. "And how do you feel about that truth?" "Like I've been living a lie for 15 years, Jon said quietly. "Like everything I thought I knew about my life was carefully constructed fiction." "Welcome to the Lannister family experience," Tyrion said with dark humor. "We specialize in uncomfortable truths and strategic deceptions. The question is, what do you intend to do with this new knowledge?" Jon was quiet for a long moment, watching the servants load the last of the wagons. "I'm going to stay," he said finally. "And I'm going to figure out who I really am beneath all the training and expectations and careful control." "That's a dangerous path," Tyrion warned. "My sister doesn't take kindly to former assets asserting their independence." "Then I'll have to be very careful," Jon replied. "But I'd rather face that danger as myself than live safely as someone else's weapon." Tyrion studied the young man's face, noting the new resolve beneath the uncertainty. Jon Snow had been forged in Lannister fire, shaped by Lannister hands, but the steel that emerged was purely his own. "In that case," Tyrion said, extending his hand, "I wish you luck. You're going to need it." Jon clasped the offered hand, and for a moment, something passed between them, understanding perhaps, or mutual respect. Then the moment was gone, and Tyrion was walking away to join the royal party's departure. As the wagons rolled out of Winterfell's gates, Jon stood watching from the battlements, no longer the Lannister ward who had arrived 3 weeks ago, but not yet certain what he was becoming. The only thing he knew for sure was that the choice was finally his to make, and that, terrifying as it was, felt like freedom. The spider's web stretched across the seven kingdoms, invisible threads of information connecting castle to hovel, throne room to brothel, sept to stable, and at the center of it all, in a chamber deep beneath the Red Keep, Varys the spider sat reading reports by candlelight, his soft hands moving delicately across parchment as he absorbed the whispers of a realm. The morning's correspondence lay sorted before him in careful piles, urgent matters to the left, routine intelligence in the center, and curiosities that might prove significant to the right. It was in this last pile that he found the most interesting item of the day, a coded message from one of his little birds in the north, written in the careful script of a servant who cleaned chambers and emptied chamber pots, and was therefore invisible to the great lords who shaped the fate of kingdoms. The bastard stays. The queen departed in fury. The wolf pup grows teeth. Such simple words, yet they carried implications that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Jon Snow, ward of House Lannister, bastard son of Ned Stark, and according to his doubts, maybe an unknowing prince of a fallen dynasty, had made a choice that would reshape the political landscape of Westeros, whether he knew it or not. Varys set the message aside, and reached for another report. This one from King's Landing itself. His network within the capital was extensive, reaching into every level of society from the highest lords to the lowest beggars. Today's intelligence painted a picture of a court in subtle transition, with undercurrents of tension that most would miss but which spoke volumes to those who knew how to listen. "The Queen grows restless," wrote one of his sources, within the Red Keep's servant quarters. "She speaks often with her brother, and their conversations end in whispers. The king drinks more than usual, and speaks of the old days. The Hand's Tower remains empty, but not unvisited." Varys smiled at that last detail. Someone was searching Jon Arryn's former chambers, looking for whatever secrets the late Hand might have left behind. The question was whether they were trying to hide those secrets, or expose them. Given the players involved, either possibility could prove catastrophic for the realm's stability. He turned to a third report, this one from the Reach. Lord Tyrell was moving grain supplies north, ostensibly to ensure adequate stores for the coming winter. But the timing and route suggested something more strategic, preparation perhaps for the possibility of conflict, or simply prudent planning by a lord who understood that wars were won as much by logistics as by swords. But it was the fourth report that truly captured Varys' attention. Written in the flowing script of a maester's assistant at Old Town, it detailed recent research requests from various lords and their representatives. Someone had been asking questions about bloodlines, about the inheritance of physical traits, about the genealogies of great houses stretching back generations. Lord Stannis Baratheon's man made particular inquiries about the Baratheon line, the report noted. He seemed most interested in the consistency of certain characteristics across generations. The Grand Maester's assistant provided several texts on the subject, including the lineages and histories of the great houses of the Seven Kingdoms. Varys leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him, as he considered the implications. Stannis Baratheon was many things, rigid, humorless, utterly without charm, but he was not stupid. If Robert's younger brother was investigating bloodlines, particularly his own family's bloodlines, then someone had planted seeds of doubt about the royal succession. The same doubts that had likely gotten Jon Arryn killed. A soft knock at his chamber door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, though he already knew who it would be. Only one person knocked with such precise, measured taps. Lord Varys. The man who entered was unremarkable in every way. Average height, brown hair, forgettable face. He wore the simple robes of a clerk, and his hands bore the ink stains of someone who spent his days copying documents and filing reports. To most observers he would be invisible, just another faceless bureaucrat in the vast machinery of royal administration. Which was exactly what made him so valuable. "Carburn," Varys said pleasantly. "What news from the rookery?" "3 ravens from the north, in the past day, my lord. All bearing the Stark seal, all addressed to different recipients here in the capital." Coburn moved closer to the desk, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "One to Lord Stannis, one to the Grand Maester, and one to you, my lord." Varys raised an eyebrow. "How interesting, and the contents?" The first 2 were sealed with the formal wax, suggesting official correspondence. The third, Coburn produced a small scroll from within his robes, was sealed with common wax and marked "for your eyes only." Varys took the scroll and broke the seal, his eyes scanning the brief message within. It was from one of his most reliable sources in Winterfell, a servant who had been in his employ for nearly a decade. The message was characteristically brief. The Lannister ward chooses the wolf pack. The Queen's claws were shown, but not used. The young wolf learns he was always prey, not pet. Dangerous knowledge spreads. Fascinating, Varys murmured, setting the message aside. It seems our northern friends are more perceptive than some give them credit for. My lord? Nothing that need concern you directly, my dear Qyburn. But tell me, what do you make of the timing? 3 ravens, all departing Winterfell on the same day that the royal party begins its journey south. Qyburn considered the question with the careful attention he brought to all matters of intelligence. Coordination, perhaps. Lord Stark may be taking steps to protect himself, or to warn others of potential dangers. Or he may be setting larger wheels in motion. Varys agreed. The question is whether those wheels will crush him or carry him to safety. He turned his attention to another pile of reports, these from various points along the King's Road. The royal party's progress was being carefully monitored, not just by his own agents, but by others as well. Someone else was very interested in the movements of the Queen and her retinue. The Lannisters travel with a smaller escort than usual, he observed, reading through the details. Interesting choice, given the current tensions. Perhaps they feel secure in their strength, Qyburn suggested. Or perhaps they're trying not to appear threatening while they consolidate their position. Varys set the reports aside and reached for a map of the 7 kingdoms, his finger tracing the various roads and waterways that connected the great houses. Tell me, what do you know of wards? The question seemed to surprise Qyburn. My lord? Wards. Specifically, the legal and political implications of noble children raised in foreign houses, their loyalties, their potential value, their usefulness as political assets or leverage. Well, Qyburn began carefully, wards traditionally serve to cement alliances between houses, or to ensure good behavior from potentially troublesome lords. They're educated alongside their host family's children, trained in their customs and values. In theory, they become bridges between houses. And in practice? In practice, they're often hostages with better accommodations. Qyburn's voice carried a note of cynicism. Valuable pieces in the Game of Thrones, to be moved and sacrificed as political necessity demands. Indeed, Varys folded the map carefully and returned it to its place among his papers. And what of a ward who chooses to reject his host family's influence, who decides to forge his own path? Reburn's eyes sharpened with understanding. That would depend entirely on the circumstances, my lord, and on how much his former hosts valued his continued cooperation. Hypothetically speaking, of course, such a person might find themselves at the center of considerable political interest, particularly if their true parentage was more significant than commonly believed. Hypothetically speaking, Qyburn agreed, though his tone suggested he understood they were discussing something far from hypothetical. Moeus smiled, pleased with his subordinate's discretion. I have a task for you, my dear fellow. I want you to compile a comprehensive report on the current political situation in the north. The relationships between the great houses, their recent correspondence, any unusual movements or preparations. All of it, my lord. All of it. But pay particular attention to House Stark's recent activities, and to any information regarding their extended family members. Varys's voice took on a note of urgency. The realm may soon have need of such intelligence. Qyburn bowed and departed, leaving Varys alone with his thoughts and his reports. The spider returned his attention to the intelligence from the north, reading between the lines of coded messages and careful observations. Jon Snow's decision to remain at Winterfell was more than simple rebellion against his Lannister upbringing. It was a declaration of independence that could reshape the political landscape of the 7 kingdoms. The boy had been raised as a weapon against his own father, trained to be the perfect hostage disguised as a ward. But weapons, Varys knew, sometimes turned in their wielder's hands. The young man had no idea of the forces he was setting in motion. He couldn't know that his choice to stay in the north would ripple outward, affecting the plans of queens and kings, lords and spy masters, all the great players in the Game of Thrones. He certainly couldn't know the true significance of his bloodline, the secret that only 2 men in the 7 kingdoms fully understood. But Varys knew, and knowledge, as always, was power. He reached for a fresh piece of parchment and began composing a message of his own, written in the coded language he used for only his most trusted agents. The message would travel north by Raven, then be carried by swift horses to a small inn on the King's Road, where certain travelers might find it waiting. "The dragon's heir has chosen his path," he wrote carefully. "The wolf pack gathers around their lost cub. The lions grow restless at the loss of their prize. All pieces move toward their destined positions. Watch, wait, report." He sealed the message with plain wax and summoned a servant to carry it to the rookery. Then he returned to his reports, his soft hands moving steadily through the intelligence that flowed into King's Landing like tributaries feeding a great river. Somewhere in the north, Jon Snow was learning what it meant to be more than just a political pawn. Somewhere on the King's Road, Cersei Lannister was wondering why her father told her to leave the boy there, and was planning her response to a ward who had dared to assert his independence. Somewhere in the capital, men were asking dangerous questions about bloodlines and succession. And in the depths of the Red Keep, Varys the Spider sat at the center of his web, feeling every tremor, every vibration, every subtle shift in the great game that would determine the fate of kingdoms. The boy didn't know he was the son of Prince Rhaegar, Targaryen, and Lyanna Stark. He didn't know he had a stronger claim to the Iron Throne than the man who currently sat upon it. He didn't know that his very existence was a threat to the stability of the realm, or that his survival depended on secrets that only a handful of people were willing to keep. But he was learning to think for himself, to question the truths he had been taught, to forge his own identity separate from the expectations of others. And that perhaps was the most dangerous development of all. The threads of destiny were drawing tight. Soon, very soon, someone would have to cut them or be strangled by their weight. Varys intended to make sure he was holding the scissors when that moment came. Arya. The morning air bit sharp against Arya's cheeks as she stood in the shadow of the broken tower, watching the last of the royal party's preparations. Servants scurried about loading wagons, their breath steaming in white puffs as they worked. The Queen's wheelhouse sat ready in the courtyard, its golden lions gleaming despite the gray sky overhead. But Arya's attention wasn't on the departure preparations. It was on Jon Snow, who stood near the stable speaking quietly with Tyrion Lannister. There was something different about him this morning, a tension in his shoulders, a careful way he held himself that reminded her of a wolf testing unfamiliar ground. 3 weeks. That's how long he had been at Winterfell, and Arya still couldn't quite figure him out. When he had first arrived with the royal party, she had expected another pampered lordling ward, soft, arrogant, dismissive of northern ways. Instead, she found someone who moved through Winterfell's halls with quiet observation, who spoke little but listened much, who seemed to be searching for something he couldn't quite name. "You're staring," came a voice behind her. Arya turned to find Sansa approaching, her sister's face composed in the perfect expression of courtly neutrality she had perfected over the years. But Arya could see the curiosity beneath the mask. Sansa had been watching the Lannister ward too. "So are you," Arya replied, nodding toward where Sansa's gaze had been fixed on the same scene. Sansa's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't deny it. "He's not what I expected." "How so?" "When Father told us a Lannister ward would be accompanying the royal party, I imagined someone more." Sansa paused, searching for the right word. "More like them, I suppose. Golden and proud and southern, but he's not, is he?" Arya considered the observation. Jon Snow, if that was even his real name, had been raised by Lannisters, trained in their ways, educated in their customs. But watching him these past weeks, seeing how he looked at the Godswood with something like longing, how he seemed most comfortable in the quiet corners of the castle, there was something that didn't quite fit the southern lordling mold. "No," she said finally, "he's not." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Jon clasped Tyrion's hand in farewell. The dwarf said something that made Jon's mouth quirk in what might have been a smile, then turned and walked toward his horse. "Do you think he wanted to stay?" Sansa asked quietly. "I heard he's remaining at Winterfell instead of returning south." Arya had heard the same rumors whispered among the servants and discussed in hushed tones by the guards. The Lannister ward choosing to remain in the north rather than return to his golden family. It was the sort of decision that would have consequences far beyond Winterfell's walls. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think he's been looking for something since he arrived. Maybe he found it here." Robb Stark stood on the battlements overlooking the main courtyard, watching the organized chaos below with the eye of someone who had been trained to notice details others might miss. The royal party's departure was proceeding smoothly, perhaps too smoothly for a queen who had just lost a valuable ward to northern sentiment. His father had been more tense than usual since the royal party's arrival, moving through Winterfell's halls with the careful attention of a man expecting trouble, and there had been undercurrents throughout the visit. Subtle tensions, whispered conversations that stopped when others approached, meaningful glances exchanged between people who should have been strangers. The Lannister ward was at the center of it all, though Robb doubted the young man understood his own significance. Brooding again, Robb turned to find Theon Greyjoy approaching, the Ironborn's usual smirk firmly in place, but there was something sharper than usual in Theon's eyes, a calculating look that Robb had learned to associate with political maneuvering. Observing, Robb corrected. There's a difference. If you say so. Theon moved to stand beside him at the battlements, his gaze following Robb's to the courtyard below. Quite a show they're putting on down there. All very civilized and proper.
You sound disappointed.
Maybe a little. I was hoping for more drama. The queen looked ready to spit fire when she came out of that tower yesterday. Tyrion's grin widened. Whatever conversation she had with her ward, it didn't go according to plan. Robb had noticed that too. Cersei Lannister was many things, but subtle wasn't one of them when her temper was roused. The fact that she was maintaining such careful composure now suggested either remarkable self-control or very careful planning. What do you make of him? Robb asked, nodding toward Jon Snow. The Lannister ward. Hard to say. He's not what I expected from someone raised at Casterly Rock. Theon paused, considering there's something northern about him. Despite the southern polish. The way he moves, the way he watches things. It's like he's remembering something he thought he'd forgotten. Below them, Jon was saying goodbye to members of the royal party, his manner polite but distant. He moved through the farewells with practiced grace, but Robb could see the tension in the young man's posture. Father seems to know more about him than he's saying, Robb observed. Your father knows more about most things than he's saying. It's what makes him dangerous. Theon's expression grew more serious. But you're right, there's history there. Something that goes back further than just this visit. Ned Stark stood in his solar, watching through the tall windows as the royal party made their final preparations for departure. In a few hours they would be gone, taking with them the immediate political complications that had plagued Winterfell for the past 3 weeks. But they would also be leaving behind new complications, new dangers that might prove even more challenging to navigate. Jon's decision to remain at Winterfell had been both a relief and a source of deep concern. Relief, because it meant Lyanna's son would be safe from immediate Lannister manipulation. Concern, because it also meant he would be exposed to truths that had been carefully hidden for 17 years. The young man, Ned corrected himself, had no idea who he really was. Raised as a Lannister ward, told he was some minor lord's bastard taken in out of political necessity. He had lived his entire conscious life believing a carefully constructed lie. But now he was asking questions, subtle ones, carefully phrased, but questions nonetheless. About his origins, about his early childhood, about the inconsistencies in the stories he had been told. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come," he called. Maester Luwin entered, his gray robes rustling softly as he moved. The old man's face was troubled, his usual calm composure marred by obvious concern. "My lord," Luwin began, then paused as if uncertain how to continue. "Speak freely, Maester. What troubles you?"
"It's about the boy, Fat John."
"He came to me this morning with questions about his parentage. Direct questions, my lord, not the careful inquiries he's been making these past weeks." Luwin moved closer to the desk, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I believe the Queen may have told him something during their conversation yesterday." Ned felt his stomach tighten. This was what he had feared most. That Jon's return to Winterfell would awaken curiosities that had been safely dormant during his years in the South, or worse, that the Lannisters would reveal partial truths as a weapon. "What sort of questions?" He asked directly if he was your bastard son. When I tried to deflect, he said he already knew the answer, that it had been confirmed by someone he trusted to tell him the truth. Luwin's expression was grave. "My lord, if the Queen has revealed that much..." "She's playing a dangerous game," Ned finished. Cersei Lannister was many things, but she wasn't stupid. If she had confirmed Jon's parentage, it was for a specific purpose, likely to bind him to her through shared secrets, while keeping the larger truth hidden. But it also meant the carefully constructed lies that had protected Jon for 17 years were beginning to crumble. What did you tell him? Nothing beyond what we agreed upon years ago. But my lord, he's not a child anymore. He won't be satisfied with vague answers and deflections, especially now that he knows we've been lying to him about something so fundamental. Ned nodded, understanding the dilemma. They had always known this day would come. The day when Jon would demand real answers about his origins. They had simply hoped it would come later, when the political situation was more stable, when the truth would be less dangerous to reveal. Keep deflecting for now, Ned said finally. But prepare yourself, Maester. We may soon have no choice but to tell him everything.
Vida.
The courtyard was finally beginning to empty as the last of the royal party's wagons rolled through Winterfell's gates. Jon stood near the stables, watching the procession disappear into the distance, and tried to process everything that had changed in the span of a single conversation. "You're Ned Stark's bastard." The words echoed in his mind, carrying with them the weight of 17 years of carefully maintained lies. He was Jon Snow, not Jon whoever the Lannisters had told him he was. Ned Stark was his father, not some minor lord whose name he had never quite been able to remember clearly. The revelation should have been shocking, but instead it felt like confirmation of something he had suspected since the moment he set foot in Winterfell. The way Ned Stark looked at him, the careful distance the man maintained, the subtle resemblance that others had begun to notice, it all made sense now. But it also raised 1,000 new questions. If Ned Stark was his father, who was his mother? Why had he been sent away so young? What had the Lancers gained by raising him? And what did they expect in return? He turned to find Ned Stark approaching, the man who was apparently his father moving with his usual measured stride. There was something different in Ned's expression now, a wariness that hadn't been there before, as if he knew that fundamental truths had shifted. "My lord," Jon said carefully, unsure of the proper protocol for addressing one's newly discovered father. "We need to talk," Ned said quietly. "But not here, not where others might overhear. Tonight, after the evening meal, meet me in the Godswood." Jon nodded, though the prospect filled him with equal parts anticipation and dread. Whatever Ned Stark wanted to discuss in the privacy of the Godswood, it was clearly connected to the revelations that had turned his world upside down. "My lord," Jon began, then stopped. The formal address felt wrong now, but he wasn't sure what else to call the man who was his father, but had been a stranger for most of his life. "There will be time for all of that tonight," Ned said gently. "For now, just know that whatever else happens, whatever other truths come to light, you are safe here. You are welcome here." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, and Jon found himself nodding before he fully understood why. For the first time in his life, he had answers to questions that had haunted him since childhood. They weren't complete answers, and they raised new mysteries, but they were a beginning. As Ned walked back toward the keep, Jon remained by the stables, watching the last of the royal party disappear into the distance. Somewhere among those wagons and riders, Cersei Lannister was probably planning her next move, deciding how to respond to a ward who had chosen independence over obligation. But for the first time in 17 years, Jon Snow knew who he was. He was Ned Stark's bastard son, raised by enemies, returned to his father's house. Whatever came next, he would face it as himself, not as someone else's carefully crafted weapon. Cersei. The wheelhouse rocked gently as it rolled south along the King's Road, but Queen Cersei Lannister barely noticed the motion. Her attention was focused entirely on the letter she was composing, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood that language could be as deadly as any blade. "My dear father," she wrote, "I write to inform you that Eddard Stark has accepted the position as King's Hand, and has requested that he will arrive in Red Keep after a short time as he needs time to consolidate his family situations and deal with matters related to his younger son's accident. And Robert has granted him his permission. And also to report of an unexpected development regarding our northern ward." She paused, considering how best to phrase Jon Snow's defection. The boy had chosen to remain at Winterfell, despite her best efforts to bind him through shared secrets and carefully revealed truths. It was a miscalculation on her part. She had assumed that confirming his parentage would make him more dependent on Lannister protection, not less. The boy has chosen to remain at Winterfell rather than return to the capital. As planned, despite my efforts to secure his continued loyalty through strategic revelation of certain truths about his origins, he appears determined to forge his own path. The words tasted bitter as she wrote them. She had played her hand carefully, confirming that he was indeed Ned Stark's bastard, while keeping the larger, more dangerous truth hidden. It should have been enough to ensure his gratitude and continued cooperation. Instead, it had apparently given him the confidence to assert his independence. I believe this development represents a significant shift in our northern strategy. The boy now knows he is Stark's bastard, which may complicate our ability to use him as leverage against his father. I recommend we allow him to remain at Winterfell for now, while we assess how best to use this new situation to our advantage. The boy's desire for independence may actually serve our purposes better than his continued presence at court. I await your guidance on how to proceed. Your devoted daughter, Cersei. She sealed the letter with red wax and the Lion of House Lannister, then summoned one of her guards to arrange for its swift delivery to Casterly Rock. Tywin would not be pleased with this development, but he would understand the strategic implications. The Game of Thrones was about to become significantly more complicated, but then Cersei had never been one to shy away from complexity. Let Jon Snow enjoy his moment of independence. Let him discover what it meant to be a Stark bastard in the north. The morning sun filtered through the frost-covered windows of what had once been a guest chamber, and was now, Jon supposed, simply his room. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, staring at his hands as if they might hold answers to questions he wasn't sure how to ask. You're Ned Stark's bastard. 3 days had passed since Cersei's revelation. 3 days since the royal party had departed Winterfell, and Jon still felt as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted permanently. Everything he thought he knew about himself had been built on lies, carefully constructed, well-intentioned lies perhaps, but lies nonetheless. A soft whine drew his attention to the corner of the room, where Ghost lay curled on a pile of furs. The white direwolf had appeared at Winterfell shortly after Jon's arrival, as if summoned by some instinct. Neither of them understood. The beast was smaller than the wolves that followed the Stark children, but there was an intelligence in his red eyes that sometimes made Jon feel as though Ghost understood more about his situation than he did. What do you think, boy? Jon asked quietly, reaching out to scratch behind the wolf's ears. Am I making the right choice? Staying here? Ghost's only response was to press his head against Jon's palm, but somehow that simple gesture was more comforting than any words could have been. The direwolf had chosen him, just as he had chosen to remain at Winterfell. Perhaps that was enough for now. Jon rose and moved to the window, looking out over the courtyard where servants were already going about their morning tasks. Somewhere in the keep, the Stark family was beginning their day, his half-siblings, though they didn't know it yet. His father, though 17 years of separation made that relationship feel more theoretical than real. The thought of Ned Stark brought a familiar tightness to Jon's chest. The man had been kind during his stay at Winterfell, more welcoming than Jon had any right to expect. But there was always a distance there, a careful reserve that Jon now understood had nothing to do with courtesy and everything to do with guilt. How did a man greet the son he had given away? How did he explain 17 years of absence, of allowing that son to be raised by enemies? Jon didn't blame Ned Stark. The political realities that had led to his placement with the Lannisters were complex, and he was beginning to understand that his father had likely had few good choices. But understanding didn't make the emotional reality any easier to navigate. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Come, he called, turning from the window. To his surprise, it was Arya Stark who entered, carrying a tray of bread and cheese. The girl moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged completely in her surroundings. And Jon felt a stab of something that might have been envy. I brought you breakfast, she said simply, setting the tray on the small table near the window. You missed the morning meal. Thank you. Jon wasn't sure what else to say. His interactions with the Stark children had been limited and carefully polite, more like diplomatic exchanges than family conversations. Arya studied him for a moment, her gray eyes, Stark eyes, Jon realized, taking in his rumpled appearance and the shadows under his eyes. You look like you haven't slept. I haven't much. There was no point in lying about it. The past few nights had been filled with restless turning and half-remembered dreams that left him feeling more exhausted than when he'd gone to bed. Is it because of what the Queen told you? The Jon's head snapped up, meeting Arya's direct gaze. How do you— I listen, she said with a slight shrug. People talk, especially servants. They think children don't hear things, but we do. She moved closer to the window, looking out at the same view Jon had been contemplating. They say your father's bastard, that you're our brother. The word hung in the air between them, carrying weight that Jon wasn't sure how to bear. Brother, it was what he had wanted to hear for as long as he could remember. But now that it was spoken aloud, it felt both wonderful and terrifying.
Does that bother you? He asked carefully.
Her considered the question with the seriousness of someone far older than her years. I always wanted another brother, she said finally. Ricken's too young for most things, and Ricken's practically a baby. Rob's the heir, so he has to be responsible all the time. She glanced at Jon. Maybe you could be different. Different how? I don't know yet, but you're not like other lordlings I've met. You watch things, like you're trying to figure out how they work, and you don't talk down to people just because they're not highborn. She paused. Plus, Ghost likes you, and dire wolves are good judges of character. As if summoned by his name, Ghost rose from his corner and padded over to where they stood. The dire wolf was nearly as tall as Arya, and she reached out without fear to run her fingers through his white fur. He's beautiful, she said softly. How did he met you? I don't know. He just appeared one day, not long after I arrived. Maybe he was waiting for you, Arya suggested. Maybe he knew you belonged here before you did. The simple words hit Jon with unexpected force. Belonged here. It was what he wanted more than anything, but it was also what terrified him most. Belonging meant responsibility, meant becoming part of something larger than himself. It meant accepting that he was Jon Snow, bastard son of Ned Stark, with all the complications that identity entailed. Arya, he began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the question that had been haunting him. What? Do you think the others will accept me? As their brother, I mean. Really accept me, not just tolerate me because they have to. Arya's expression grew thoughtful. Sansa might take some time. She cares a lot about what's proper and what people think. But she's not cruel, just careful. Bran will probably be excited. He loves stories, and you're like something out of a song. A lost brother, returned home. She smiled slightly. Rob's harder to read, but he's fair. If father acknowledges you, Rob will too. And you. I already told you, I wanted another brother. Her smile widened. Besides, anyone who can make Ghost choose them can't be all bad. Jon felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. It wasn't acceptance from the entire family. Not yet, but it was a beginning. And perhaps, for now, that was enough. The Godswood was quiet in the early afternoon, dappled sunlight filtering through the ancient trees to create patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. Catelyn Stark walked the familiar paths with measured steps, seeking the peace she had always found among the old gods' domain, even though her own faith lay with the Seven. She had come here to think, to process the changes that Jon Snow's presence had brought to Winterfell. The young man, she corrected herself, had been polite during his stay, keeping to himself and making no demands on the family's attention. But his very existence was a reminder of things Catelyn preferred not to dwell upon, of the one area where her marriage to Ned had never found complete harmony. The sound of a familiar voice drew her attention, and she paused behind a cluster of ironwood trees, recognizing Ned's low tones. He was speaking to someone, though she couldn't see who from her position. I should have found another way, Ned was saying, his voice heavy with regret. Should have kept you safe myself, instead of sending you so far away. Catelyn frowned, moving carefully closer. Who was Ned talking to? She couldn't hear another voice. Couldn't see anyone else in the small clearing ahead. Lyanna, I'm sorry. I failed you. Failed him. 17 years, and I let them raise him as their weapon instead of protecting him as I promised. The words hit Catelyn like a physical blow. Lyanna, Ned was talking to Lyanna's statue, the carved stone figure that watched over the Godswood with sightless eyes. But more than that, he was talking about failing him, about sending someone away, about letting them raise him. He's so much like you, Ned continued, unaware of his wife's presence. Stubborn, brave, too willing to sacrifice himself for others. But he's also like Rhaegar, intelligent, thoughtful, carrying himself like he was born to lead even when he doesn't realize it. A pause, heavy with pain. I should have told him the truth years ago. Should have found a way to bring him home sooner. Catelyn's breath caught in her throat. The truth about Jon Snow. About Lyanna's son. Lyanna's son. The pieces fell into place, with horrible clarity. Jon Snow wasn't Ned's bastard at all. He was Lyanna's child, Rhaegar Targaryen's son, the nephew Ned had claimed as his own bastard to protect him from Robert's wrath. The boy she had resented for 17 years, the living reminder of what she had believed was her husband's infidelity, was actually her husband's nephew, and the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. I don't know how to be his father now, Ned was saying. How to bridge 17 years of absence, 17 years of lies. He looks at me like he wants to trust me. But how can he, when everything he's been told about himself has been false? Catelyn stepped backward, her mind reeling. She needed to leave, needed to process this revelation away from Ned's private moment of grief and guilt. But her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled, the sound of breaking branches echoing through the quiet grove. Ned spun around, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt before he recognized her. Catelyn, I didn't hear you approach. For a moment they stared at each other in silence. Catelyn could see the exact moment when Ned realized how much she had overheard, could watch the careful mask of composure slip over his features. How long have you been standing there? He asked quietly. Long enough. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, hollow and distant. Long enough to learn that I've spent 17 years hating an innocent boy for a sin he never committed. Ned's shoulders sagged, the weight of his secrets suddenly visible in the lines of his face. Cat, he's not your bastard. The words came out flat, matter of fact. He's Lyanna's son. Rhaegar's son. Yes. The simple confirmation hung between them like a blade. Catelyn felt as though the world had tilted on its axis, as though everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her family, her life, had been built on foundations of sand. Why? She whispered. Why didn't you tell me? Ned moved closer, his gray eyes filled with pain, and something that might have been relief. Because Robert would have killed him. Because the fewer people who knew the truth, the safer Jon would be. Because I gave Lyanna my word that I would protect her son. And that meant protecting him from everyone, even you. Even me? Catelyn tasted the bitterness of those words. You thought I would betray him? That I would put an innocent child at risk? No, never that. Ned's voice was firm. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, Cat. The more people who know a truth, the more likely it is to come to light. And this truth, he gestured helplessly, this truth could start another war. Catelyn stared at her husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in their marriage. The careful distance he had always maintained when discussing Jon, the guilt that shadowed his eyes whenever the boy's name was mentioned, the way he had never quite been able to meet her gaze when she expressed her resentment. It all made sense now. You've been carrying this alone for 17 years, she said. Not entirely alone. Howland Reed knows, and Maester Luwin suspects. I think there may be other people like Rice who suspect it, but I have carefully removed all the proofs. But yes, mostly alone. Ned's expression was bleak. It was the price of keeping him safe. And now he's here, at Winterfell, asking questions, learning truths that have been hidden his entire life. Yes, and I don't know what to do about it. Ned ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had seen countless times, but never fully understood. He knows he's my bastard. Cersei told him that much before she left, but the rest could get him killed. Catelyn finished the thought, understanding dawning. If Robert ever learned that Rhaegar's son was alive, Robert would see it as the ultimate betrayal. He would demand Jon's head, and probably mine as well. Ned's voice was grim. The boy has no idea what he really is, what his very existence means for the stability of the realm. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of shared knowledge settling between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Catelyn felt the anger and resentment that had poisoned her heart for 17 years, beginning to transform into something else. Guilt, perhaps, or a fierce protectiveness she had never allowed herself to feel for Ned's supposed bastard. What do we do now? She asked finally. We protect him, Ned said simply. We give him the family he's never had, the acceptance he's been searching for, and we pray that the truth stays buried long enough for him to find his own path. Catelyn nodded slowly, her mind already working through the implications. Jon Snow, Jon Targaryen, though he must never know it, was no longer just Ned's burden to bear. He was part of their family now, part of their responsibility. "I need to speak with him," she said. Ned's eyebrows rose. "Cat, not about the truth. About other things. About his place here. About what it means to be a Stark." She met her husband's gaze steadily. "I've been almost cruel to him every time we met, Ned. Not openly, but in small ways, in the distance I've maintained. If he's to be part of this family, that needs to change. And if he asks questions, if he starts investigating his origins more deeply, then we'll deal with that when it happens." Capsule. Tyrion's voice carried a new resolve. "But for now he's a 17-year-old boy, who's just learned his entire life has been built on lies. He needs stability, acceptance, love, things I should have given him years ago if I had known the truth." Ned stepped closer, reaching out to take her hands in his. "I'm sorry, Kat, for the lies, for the burden I've placed on our marriage, for asking you to accept something I never properly explained." "You were protecting him. Protecting all of us." Catelyn squeezed his hands. "I understand that now, but Ned, no more secrets between us. Not about Jon, not about anything that could affect our family." "No more secrets," he agreed. As they walked back toward the keep together, Catelyn felt as though she was seeing Winterfell with new eyes. Somewhere in those ancient walls was a young man who believed himself to be her husband's bastard, who had no idea that he carried the blood of kings in his veins. He was her nephew by marriage, her responsibility by choice, and if she could find the courage to bridge 17 years of hatred, she felt, perhaps even her son by love. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be questions to deflect, truths to protect, and a careful balance to maintain between acceptance and secrecy. But for the first time since Jon Snow had arrived at Winterfell, Catelyn felt ready to face those challenges. After all, protecting one's children, all of one's children, was what mothers did. Jon was in the armory, examining a practice sword with the critical eye of someone who had been trained by the best masters gold could buy, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Lady Catelyn Stark standing in the doorway, her auburn hair catching the light from the forge. "My lady," he said, setting down the sword and offering a respectful bow. Throughout his stay at Winterfell, his interactions with Ned Stark's wife had been minimal and carefully polite. She had been courteous, but distant, and Jon had sensed that his presence made her uncomfortable. "Done." She stepped into the armory, her green eyes studying him with an intensity that made him want to fidget. "I was hoping we might speak privately." "Of course." Jon gestured to a bench near the wall. "Would you like to sit?" Catelyn shook her head, instead moving to examine some of the weapons hanging on the walls. "I understand you've decided to remain at Winterfell rather than return south with the royal party." "Yes, my lady, if that's acceptable to you and Lord Stark." "It's more than acceptable." She turned to face him, and Jon was surprised by the warmth in her expression. "Jon, I owe you an apology." "My lady, I have not been welcoming during your stay here. I've maintained a distance that was neither kind nor fair, and I want you to know that it had nothing to do with you personally." Jon felt heat rise in his cheeks. "You don't owe me any apologies, my lady. I'm grateful for the hospitality you've shown." "Stop." Catelyn's voice was gentle, but firm. "You don't need to be grateful for basic courtesy, Jon. You're family." The word hit him like a physical blow. Family. It was what he had wanted to hear more than anything. But coming from Lady Catelyn, who had every reason to resent his presence, it felt almost too good to be true. "I know this situation is complicated," Catelyn continued. "I know that learning about your parentage has been difficult, and I know that finding your place in this family won't be simple. But I want you to understand that you are welcome here, not as a guest, not as a political necessity, but as our son." Jon's throat tightened. "My lady, Catelyn, or mother, if you're comfortable with that. The choice is yours." The offer hung in the air between them, carrying weight that Jon wasn't sure he was ready to bear. A mother, he had never had one, had never even known who his birth mother was. The idea of claiming that relationship with someone who had no obligation to offer it was both wonderful and terrifying. "I don't want to presume." "You're not presuming anything. I'm offering." Catelyn moved closer, her expression earnest. Jon, I know I can't replace the mother you never knew, and I'm not trying to, but I can offer you the love and support you deserve, if you'll let me. Jon stared at her, searching her face for any sign of deception or obligation. But all he saw was sincerity, and perhaps a hint of regret for opportunities missed. Why? He asked quietly. Why now? Catelyn was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. Because I've realized that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice, about the people we choose to love and protect, and stand by. You chose to stay here, to be part of this family. The least I can do is choose to welcome you properly. The simple honesty of her words broke something loose in Jon's chest. For 17 years, he had been an outsider, valued by the Lannisters for his potential usefulness, but never truly belonging anywhere. The idea that he could choose his family, that they could choose him in return, was revolutionary. I would like that, he said finally. Very much. Catelyn's smile was radiant. Good. Then we'll start fresh, you and I. No more distance, no more careful politeness. You're my son now, Jon Snow, and I intend to treat you as such. As she moved toward the door, Jon called after her. Captain? She turned back, eyebrows raised. Thank you for giving me a chance. Thank you for taking it, she replied. Now, I expect you at the evening meal tonight, as part of the family, not as a guest. And Jon? Yes? Welcome home. After she left, Jon stood alone in the armory for a long time, processing everything that had just happened. Ghost appeared at some point, padding silently into the room to sit beside him, and Jon absently scratched the direwolf's ears while his mind raced. He had a family, not just a father who acknowledged him out of duty, but a mother who had chosen to love him, siblings who were beginning to accept him, a place where he belonged not because of his usefulness but because of who he was. For the first time in his life, Jon Snow was exactly where he was supposed to be. The truth of his parentage, whatever larger secrets might still be hidden, would have to wait. For now, it was enough to be Ned Stark's bastard, Catelyn's chosen son, a brother to the Stark children. It was enough to be home.